Hi, I'm Jane McCallion.
And I'm Adam Shepherd.
And you're listening to the ITPro Podcast, where we are celebrating our first birthday. Yes, if you can remember all the way back to November 2019, a different world, a different time. Yes, and I think possibly two young, green, slightly less professional podcasters hit the airwaves with the ITPro Podcast.
It's hard to believe that we've been going for an entire year, not least of all because we got started in the before times.
Just before, though. I think it kind of... Part of me feels that we've been going for much longer than a year because so much has happened in the intervening 12 months.
Yeah, if you want to have a good laugh, I suggest going back and listening to the early episode that we did on predicting what 2020 was going to have in store for the tech landscape. It is not correct.
I feel like we should also give a shout out to Stu Peck and Graham Cluley, who joined us as guests on our first episode. Thank you very much to them for that as well. It was a good chat and held in a studio with people and everything. It was fancy. Given that the entire sort of last 9 months or so has been particularly scary for everyone, we've decided not to do a Halloween special this year. And instead, we will be talking about open data and what we've learned about it over the past several months.
Now, open data holds many of the same tenets as open source, but instead of code being the freely accessible and usable element, it's information. Often from the field of science, but also other areas such as government or transport. Most recently, open data has formed the foundation of COVID-19 contact tracing efforts around the world.
Joining us today to talk about this trend and what lessons businesses can learn from it is Amanda Brock, CEO of Open UK. Amanda, thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you very much for having me, and happy birthday, guys. I thought I was coming on a Halloween special to talk about Halloween, so I'm really disappointed.
It's always Halloween if you want it to be.
Yeah, it's an interesting one because being Scottish, as a kid, we used to do something called guising long before the Americans were trick-or-treating. So I'm a bit of an expert in Halloween.
So, Amanda, before we dive into the topic of open data and its use in COVID-19, can you tell us a bit more about the organisation that you head up, Open UK?
Sure. I guess Open UK has existed for a little while, but not been really active until the last year when I was brought in to run the organisation. We are the UK's industry and advocacy body for open technology. And my amazing board defined that back in January as open source software, open hardware, and open data. I think we're the world's first organisation bringing the three opens together. And as we've sort of gone through the last year, pandemic aside, our various activities have very clearly started to fall under three pillars. So we now work on those three pillars, and those are community, legal and policy, and learning. We're pretty active. openuk.uk, open to anybody to participate, and you'll find more information on the website.
So I think a lot of people will be familiar with open source, open source software. I think even if you're not really a programmer, you've probably come across the idea by now. What is open data?
Yeah, so I would say that open data is a way for people to collaborate, similar to the software collaborations, using data that's publicly shared, ideally on a recognized license. Very, very similar to open source software in that way. And it's something that I think we're seeing at the heart of the pandemic, so becoming more and more topical.
So for me, one of the best examples of open data, certainly one of the most useful ones for me personally, is TfL's open data platform, which it exposes via API. And this is what allows services like Citymapper and Google Maps and all of those lovely journey planning and transport apps to give you up-to-date information on things like train times and delays and service outages and all of that kind of stuff. And it's something that has been put to incredible use by a huge number of organisations.
That's really interesting, actually. I didn't know that that's something that I am not a Londoner, that I use, that kind of transportation data. It must be what underpins Move It, which is an app that I use and have used abroad as well. And yeah, I guess I'd never thought of that as being kind of open data or anything kind of a concrete discipline, if you like.
Another really interesting implementation of open data for me is also weather data. So most government bodies will have meteorological arms which provide forecasting data to commercial weather services. And this is incredibly useful, both for, planning whether or not you need to wear a coat, but also for predicting things like storms, flooding, all of this kind of stuff. And none of it would really be possible without open data.
Interesting examples.
So, Amanda, we've got these big kind of, the corporate term is data lakes, isn't it? You've got these big piles of data that need analysing, need sharing. How does that work? Because it's all very well and good having data that's just there and accessible. There presumably needs to be some thought put into how you make sense of it, how you make it available in a usable way to people.
Yeah, and that's sort of critical and key to the issue, because we've been collecting data for years and years and years without really understanding what we want to do with it. And moving that through various different technologies. There's a number of database companies that can help with that, and open source projects, things like Cassandra, Apache Cassandra, that will help to structure the data in ways that allow it to be opened up and used productively. I think the key thing there, though, is sitting down and working out what you actually want to do with the data so that you can inform your policy and your approach up front. And that's something we're seeing a big shift in across both business and the public sector.
In what way?
I don't know how much you've followed it, but the sort of geopolitical shifts that we're seeing now are all centered around data. The conversations between the US and China, a lot of what's been happening between the US and Europe. Ursula von Leyen's, I think it was her inaugural speech last November, was very much talking about data being at the heart of strategy. So we're not just looking at business. We're seeing governments recognizing that citizen data, digital sovereignty are going to sit at the heart of the public sector's future. And if they don't have that data in a usable format, a usable way, and have it locally and accessible to them, it's not going to be possible for governments to structure strategy. That data is very much at the centre of all of their activities.
Is there an element as well, because where you just spoke about with data in regards to public policy and current affairs is not actually where I thought you were going to go. Because there's the darker side with data farming and using that kind of data aggregation, interrogating data on us and making profiles and that, all the Cambridge Analytica type stuff. Is there an element that, open data, having a much more open approach to sharing and using data in general, not necessarily personal data, can, I don't know, shine a bit of a light there? If everything's a bit more open, is it less likely to be misused, I think, is the crux of the question.
Absolutely, we would hope so. So that transparency across the public sector and government is something that's quite critical, I think, going forwards. Terence Eden, who is on my board, who was at NHSX, is back in GDS now. But he presents quite frequently around this from the public sector perspective. It's definitely worth listening to. But he frequently talks to us about how putting the user and user control at the centre of this is the way forward for the public sector. And I think he's absolutely right. So if you feel that you can see everything they're holding about you, the information that's there, and you have some control, you're going to feel a lot safer, aren't you? And that transparency is, I think, critical to it all.
Yeah.
So moving on to COVID-19, data has been a strong focus throughout this pandemic. We've been looking at things like contact tracing. We've been looking at things like the processing of medical data, for example. What role has open data played in fighting COVID-19?
I think it's really important, and I don't know whether we can say it's played enough of a role at this stage. Obviously, as with all technology, there are a number of different actors driving to the same end goal. In this case, we're looking at resolving a pandemic, we're looking at finding vaccinations, we're looking at controlling the spread of the virus through the population through test and trace, sometimes referred
Mm.
to as track and trace. So everybody wants to achieve those same goals and minimize the virus, remove the virus over time. But to get there, they all need the same data. And it's the same thing we see across the tech sector time and time again. So the more we can use open standards and make things that work together, that are transferable, and the more the data is open, the easier that's going to be for everybody to achieve.
Because one of the issues that the UK's track and trace scheme had at the outset of the coordinated response was the clash, if you like, between Google and Apple, who were wanting to contribute to the track and trace efforts via their own kind of APIs, and the UK government, who very much wanted to ensure that the track and trace data was kept open and was kept out of the data coffers, if you like,
Yeah.
of those two particular tech companies, which delayed the rollout of the official track and trace algorithm by some months.
Yeah, I think it's the test and trace app is a complicated one. Back in March, April, when they started work on it, I think wanting a centralized database, which is where the UK were heading and Germany and other countries were heading to, in many ways made sense because the experts wanted the data captured so they could learn from it and build on it, and that would input into solutions. So you can see the logic and why that was pushed for. I get the impression that Apple and Google didn't trust not just the UK, but any government and didn't want them holding data. And I know their infrastructure has caused multiple governments difficulties because they'll only allow certain data to be shared if they use the GAIN, I think it's now called GAEN API that Apple and Google were offering. And the UK sort of went down a path that isn't unexpected. Germany were doing the same thing, but the UK stuck to that for much longer, I think, than almost anybody else. Back in April, Germany gave in to the pressure that they were getting from the civil rights and privacy campaigners. And I think the key difference between the success of the two apps, if you view it in terms of having it released, Germany had a new app, they pivoted in April and had a new app out by June, whereas was the UK kept driving forward on that same basis. I think we were at end of May when the app was pulled, so 6-8 weeks later, and then obviously quite a lot later with the September release of our app, our final app. But moving from that centralized to decentralized, I don't think it's really surprising. I just think the UK were probably a little bit slow in making the pivot.
So is there more that can be done with open data to help control and limit the spread of the virus, do you think?
I think potentially, but I don't think it's as narrow as that, right? So we're all dealing with the virus, but we're all dealing with day-to-day life as well and how we manage what we do. So we're actually, we haven't talked about this, but we're working on a project with Arup, the engineering company, who are very focused on things like future cities. They're a very innovative organization. And we're running a project at the moment with them where what we're looking at is across business sectors, what data do you need? Why do you need it? And how are you going to use it in order to work out how you manage your business in the next 3, 6, 9 months? Because this new normal that we hear about frequently actually isn't going to be the new normal for very long. We talked earlier about the conferences, the conference circuit, and how it's moved to the video conferencing circuit. And people just don't want it, right? You have to get a level of interaction and engagement. And modeling and remodeling is what's going on across all of the business and I guess the public sector too. So understanding what people are doing and what they want influences every business. So we're looking at that. What data is needed, why is it needed, and how will it be used across two discrete sort of horizontals. The first one is what's defined as your 15-minute neighborhood. So where you live and where you can cycle in 15 minutes, and the new social centres. So I don't know about you guys, I've actually been to the theatre, which is slightly controversial because
Oh, wow.
it's, yeah, you know, brave women here, but actually it felt very safe. It was beautifully done at the British Theatre. But you have people now not doing that kind of stuff, right? And going to the local park to meet a friend for a walk, where they might have gone to a coffee shop or sat in a gallery or something like that. So we're sort of looking at how that shift has happened and how people's activities have changed. And then also we're looking at connection, and the connection being whether it's a podcast or a video connection, and how we move around the country, because we do still interact with each other. And for a while, people were being encouraged to go back to their offices. So we can only assume that at some point in the next 3, 6, 9 months, that may happen again. And we're just trying to fathom out what that means to us all. And I think this data piece is actually much, much bigger, as if it wasn't big enough, than the cure or the fix for the pandemic in terms of healthcare. I think there's this piece across all of our day-to-day existence where the data that business needs about all of us, collective data in many ways, but that open data needs to be shared to allow everybody to try and rebuild our society through the pandemic.
That's very interesting about that project that you've got going
Yeah.
with Arup. How did that get started?
We actually were supposed to do an open data event with them the last week of March, physically in their office, and it was going to be our showcase open data event for the year. And this pandemic stuff and lockdown messed it up, and we've taken a bit of time working out what we could do instead that would actually be useful. And this seems to be the thing that would be most use. So we're bringing people from different verticals, you know, retail, culture and media, transport and tourism, healthcare, public sector, bringing groups of them together from I think the 5th and the 11th. And then we'll have a report which we'll share on the 26th.
We're going to take a short break now, but when we come back, we'll be talking about how businesses can learn from the use of open data during the pandemic and how they can contribute to the health of the data ecosystem.
Welcome back. Now, Amanda, as you said, there's a lot really to be learnt from all of this, in terms of contact tracing and COVID itself, but also more generally, kind of how we move on. Are there any specific lessons you think that businesses can take from the experience of COVID when it comes to using open data, both as we open up and just more generally in the future?
I think the ability to use the data is going to be critical, and that means collecting it in a way that is compliant and acceptable to the end user, creating confidence in the end users about who's going to be getting the data, whether it's personal data, whether it's anonymized. That transparency, I think, is critical. And then the second thing for me, I think, is collaboration. Because what we see is the same data being needed across so many different places that using it in that collaborative way, I think, is going to be by far the most economic and efficient and, I guess, data secure way to do that.
Do you think is there an education piece to be done here a bit? Because I think it's very easy for people like us who are in the kind of tech space to just have an understanding of what is personally identifiable information. What does distraction mean? What does blah, 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 blah. With people, if we want them to hand over their data and to trust us, at any level, do people need to know more what anonymization actually means, about what disaggregation actually means, and that kind of thing, do you think?
I think there's a huge educational exercise needed in the UK at a variety of different levels. And it's not just on the open data piece. For us, across all of the opens, it's needed. Or I would say that it sits around trust and transparency, and people become more emotive about data because it affects each and every one of us, and they understand that immediately. If I say to you that everybody in this country is an open source software user, they don't get that at this stage. They will over time, but they don't get it yet. They don't understand that the internet and the cloud that they use all day long is all based on open. But what they do understand is when their personal data is opened up in a way they didn't expect, or when they read in the press that there's something to worry about in their data. I think the press is one of the levels of education that's needed. Whether that can change perhaps goes also to the nature of the press, but I don't think it's helped particularly. I think there's been an awful lot of scaremongering where it's hard to get to the real facts around data. And it's so emotive, it's easy to create that.
So in terms of the, I suppose, practical side of the data gathering operations that have been undertaken as part of COVID-19, are there any, for want of a better word, what not to do examples that businesses can take away with them?
Yeah, don't tell everybody you're about to do a test and trace app, and the Isle of Wight, I guess, is one of the... It's a risk, right? If you're putting something out to testing, the mass of the population do not understand that that's going to produce bugs, and maybe, as it was in our case, a disaster, or at least enough of a disaster that something's withdrawn. I think the educational piece really will build across business, and I mean mainstream business, not the tech sector, and individuals as time goes by. And I think that's critical, that people really begin to understand what tech means to them in their day-to-day lives. Gradually, it's a very short space of time that all of this has happened. If you think about it, I started working in a .com in 99. I'd been doing internet work before that for a couple of years. Hardly anybody used the internet then. You go in that 20-year period to a point where we're all going around with a device, generally a phone. I don't know about you, I'm always looking for my phone when I'm using my device because I forget that it's the same thing. But that's what our lives have become, where this device, it does my laundry, it does my shopping, it will book a car for me, all these different things, and now it will let me know if I've been in contact with somebody who might have a potentially lethal virus. The role that the technology and the data that we're sharing across it plays in each of our lives has gone at such a pace that we've seen business struggle to keep up with it, let alone the consumer. And going back to what we were saying about education, I think that understanding needs to be built step by step, and there needs to be a lot more targeted comms rather than sort of sensationalization when things go wrong. We hear how many thousand people didn't get added until the 3rd of October. There was a week where the data wasn't uploaded, the pandemic data. Those things happen, right? That's sort of the nature of doing bleeding edge tech. It's going to be something that people have to live with, that there will be the odd glitch or error, but overall the advantages make it worthwhile. And I think getting people to a place where they have better understanding of what the tech they're using means is important. And I think we'll see that partly because of this geopolitical stuff, which we were talking about right at the beginning, and I think we'll come back to. You hear phrases like data's the new oil or the new gold. And it really is, because all of the business models, whether they're commercial or public sector, all of the structuring that people are doing for the future of their infrastructure, the future of their businesses, sits firmly on top of data. So we're really going to have to learn about it, both individually and on a business level.
I think there's also a case for, going back to the example you mentioned of, the amount of people that were left off the track and trace system. I think there is also an argument to take as a learning, use the right tool for the right job, right? Because in that case, it was an outdated version of Excel that was being used to process and store the database. Yeah,
spreadsheets.
Exactly.
Not going there.
Not just spreadsheets, but not even the most up-to-date version of the spreadsheet software in question.
Yeah.
And
we've seen that, right? If you look at what were they called?
Equifax.
I believe, if my memory serves me rightly, that what happened there was they hadn't updated. Right? It's a known issue.
It was a known issue, and there was one instance of it in the entire organisation, but because they didn't have a full inventory of what was in their IT estate, nobody apart from like one guy knew it was there, and so nobody bothered to patch it.
Yeah. It's one of those things, if you get me started in open source, which you probably don't want me to, governance in open source is so much better, right? Because we now have OSPOs, open source program officers. We have teams of people in businesses who understand how to do the governance, how to manage the inflow and the outflow and make sure the right versions are being used and everything else around that. Because we've had to demonstrate the safety of it, the resilience of it, the good practice of it for the last decade to get business acceptance. But we don't have the same around we're actually leaps and bounds ahead. And I think we'll see that across all of the opens in the next few years, that they'll take this headway.
So I guess on that, how can organisations contribute to the overall health of the open data ecosystem?
I think that's pretty simple, and it's a question of getting involved. Start to find ways to contribute your data back, participate in activities around that. From our perspective, we're obviously doing this work over the next couple of weeks with Arup. That will then be heavily publicised when the report comes out, and we hope we'll be able to create more engagement. There are other projects like Icebreaker 1, the ODI has a number of projects, Open Data Institute has a number of projects ongoing. Finding ways to actually contribute your data back in to any of the projects that Adam mentioned in the beginning or these additional projects is really key.
So, Amanda, how can businesses get involved with Open UK?
Number of ways. Businesses or individuals would be welcome to participate in various projects that we have ongoing. They can reach out to us, hello@openuk.uk. They can follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn, openuk_UK, where we publicise our various projects. We run weekly training sessions, which are free. Fridays at noon, we have some of the world's best speakers around the opens each week. We have a financial contribution that people can make if they wish to, but you don't need to do that to participate. And you can easily sign up to the various events and activities that we've got ongoing, as well as the data stuff I've talked about. We have various projects around 5G and Open RAN. We're looking at something for COP26 around circular economy and the use of the three opens, in particular open hardware running on open source software and how that reduces carbon emissions. So all sorts of different things that you may or may not have expected going on at Open UK.
Well, unfortunately, that is all we've got time for this week. However, thank you very much, Amanda Brock, CEO of Open UK, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
If you'd like to hear more from Amanda, you can check out the keynote speech she gave on open standards in the cloud as part of ITPro Live. We'll leave a link to that in the show notes, as well as links to everything else we've spoken about today. You can find more on our website, www.itpro.co.uk, or you can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. You can also get in contact via email, where our address is podcast@itpro.co.uk.
Don't forget to subscribe to the show wherever you listen to podcasts, and if you can, leave us a rating and a review. We'll be back next week with more insight and analysis from the world of IT, but until then, goodbye.
Bye. The ITPro Podcast is brought to you by the Dennis Podcast Network.